arrival in the jungle. The dense canopy of the Viet Jungle loomed overhead, casting a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. Every step was a battle against the oppressive humidity, the air so thick it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. Sebastian Cole, the seasoned leader of the unit, moved with practiced stealth, his sharp eyes scanning the tangled undergrowth. Each rustle of a leaf, each distant call of an unseen creature set his nerves on edge. Behind him, Mark Johnson and Alan Parker followed closely. Mark's steady movements spoke of discipline and confidence, while Alan's darting eyes betrayed a growing unease. A bead of sweat trickled down Alan's temple, and he brushed it away with trembling fingers. The jungle's symphony, chirping insects, distant animal cries, and rustling leaves suddenly shattered. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, freezing the group mid-step. Sebastian raised a clenched fist, signaling for silence. His men crouched low, their weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the dense foliage. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, the once deafening hum replaced by an oppressive stillness. "Did you hear that?" Alan whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Stay sharp," Sebastian replied, his voice low and steady. His hand drifted toward his weapon, his pulse quickening. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, from the shadows ahead, came the faintest rustle, so soft it could have been imagined. Sebastian's muscles tensed, his grip tightening on his rifle. Seconds passed like hours before he finally gestured for them to move on. The trio advanced cautiously, the tension lingering in the air like an invisible predator stalking their every step. The village! As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the team stumbled upon an isolated village. Relief washed over them at first, civilization at last. But as they drew closer, the scene grew unsettling. The village was eerily intact. Wooden huts stood silent, their doors ajar. A central fire pit still smoldered, thin trails of smoke curling into the air. Tools lay abandoned, scattered across the ground. Yet there was no sign of life. Sebastian raised a hand to halt the group. "Stay sharp," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. The smell of charred wood hung in the air, mingling with something metallic and faintly sour. Mark stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dry, packed earth. "Looks like they left in a hurry," Mark observed, gesturing toward an overturned chair near one of the huts. "Or they were forced to leave," Alan added, his voice tinged with unease. He tightened his grip on his weapon, glancing around nervously. Sebastian knelt by the fire pit, sifting through the ashes with a gloved hand. The embers were faintly warm. "They weren't gone long," he said, his voice grim. "Stay on guard. Something doesn't feel right." Unsettling details. As the team moved deeper into the village, the signs of disturbance became more pronounced. Mark paused by the wall of one hut, his brow furrowing. Deep, jagged claw marks marred the wood, the grooves too precise and powerful to be the work of any natural predator. "These aren't from any animal I've ever seen," he muttered, running his fingers over the gashes. A few feet away, Alan crouched beside a mangled animal carcass. The sight was grotesque. Its remains were torn apart in a way that made Alan's stomach churn. Flies buzzed around the remains, drawn to the metallic stench that made Alan gag. This wasn't just a predator," Alan whispered, his voice trembling. "It's like something was playing with its food." The The jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening as the sun dipped lower. The oppressive silence of the jungle pressed on their ears, broken only by their own labored breathing. "Something's not right here," Alan said, standing abruptly. His eyes darted to the tree line, as if expecting something or someone to emerge. Sebastian straightened, his jaw tight. "We'll set up camp here for the night," he announced, his voice steady despite the tension gripping his chest. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Here? Are you sure that's wise?" "We don't have a choice," Sebastian replied. "We need rest and daylight to figure this out. Keep your guard up and stay close." As they began setting up their camp, the jungle's shadows seemed to stretch and shift, dancing at the edges of their vision. Faint whispers carried on the wind, too soft to understand, but impossible to ignore. As night fell, the team huddled close around their flickering fire, each of them acutely aware of the unseen eyes watching them from the darkness. The first night! The silent darkness. The campfire burned low, its waning glow casting erratic shadows that danced across the crumbling remnants of the deserted village. The jungle, usually alive with the hum of insects and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, had fallen into an unnatural silence. Even the leaves above stood eerily still, as if the entire world held its breath. Sebastian sat just outside the firelight, his rifle resting on his knees. His sharp eyes scanned the void, his body taut with anticipation. The silence was oppressive, magnifying every crackle of the fire and every faint creak of the nearby huts. Mark, ever the steady hand, was visibly unsettled, his grip on his weapon tightening with each passing second. His eyes flitted nervously to every flicker in the shadows. Closest to the fire sat Alan, pale and sweating, his trembling hands clutching his rifle like a lifeline. "Do you hear that?" Alan whispered, his voice a fragile thread barely audible over the fire's faint crackling. Sebastian tilted his head, straining his ears. At first, there was only the stillness. Then it came, faint, almost lost on the breeze, a distant scream, barely more than a whisper. It sent an icy shiver down his spine. "Stay close to the fire," Sebastian commanded, his voice low but steady. "And keep your weapons ready." A presence unseen. The hours dragged on, the fire's warmth their only anchor in the suffocating darkness. Yet even its glow couldn't shake the gnawing sensation that they were not alone. Sebastian felt it first, a prickling chill on the back of his neck. He stilled, listening intently. Then it came a whisper, soft and fleeting, like a faint breath against his ear. The words were indistinct, but their tone was urgent, almost pleading. Alan froze, his wide eyes locked on the darkness beyond the firelight. "I saw something," he croaked, his voice trembling. "In the shadows." It moved. "It's just your nerves," Mark said, though the quaver in his voice betrayed his own doubt. He cast a wary glance at the encroaching shadows, his fingers tightening around his rifle. Sebastian said nothing. He had seen it too, a brief flicker at the edge of his vision, a shape that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He chose not to voice his fears. The tension was already unbearable. Fatigue soon claimed Mark, despite his attempts to fight it. Leaning against a crumbling hut, his head drooped, and he slipped into a restless sleep. It began with murmurs, barely audible, blending with the crackling fire. But the murmurs grew louder, frantic and slurred. Mark's body twitched, his head jerking as though he were fighting something unseen. Sebastian knelt beside him, shaking him gently. "Mark, wake up!" he urged, his tone firm yet calm. Mark's lips moved, his breathing shallow and labored. The murmurs escalated to guttural moans, his body jerking violently. "Mark, wake up!" Sebastian shook him harder now, panic creeping into his voice. With a shuddering gasp, Mark's eyes snapped open. He sat bolt upright, his chest heaving, his wild eyes darting around the camp. "They were there," he rasped, his voice raw, eyes glowing, faces twisted, watching, waiting. Sebastian exchanged a grave look with Alan. Mark's words lingered, heavy and oppressive, fueling the growing sense of dread. First sighting. The night stretched on, unyielding. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting feeble light. The darkness beyond seemed to shift and ripple, alive with malevolent intent. Alan suddenly let out a strangled cry, his trembling hand pointing into the void. "There! It was right there!" Sebastian and Mark spun, their weapons raised. But there was nothing, only shadows dancing in the firelight. "I saw it," Alan insisted, his voice breaking. "Standing there, staring at us!" Sebastian's heart thundered in his chest as his gaze swept the darkness. He believed Alan. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a figment of their imagination. "Stay together," Sebastian ordered, his voice resolute despite the fear clawing at him. "We have to make it through the night." The three men huddled closer to the fire, their rifles trained on the encroaching shadows. The whispers grew louder, circling the camp, and the darkness felt suffocating. The night was far from over, and deep down they all knew they were not alone. The warning. A hidden clue. The faint light of dawn filtered through the dense jungle canopy, its pale glow struggling to break through the clinging shadows. The village, shrouded in a grey mist, seemed no less sinister in daylight. For Sebastian, Mark, and Alan, the events of the night before hung over them like a storm cloud. They sat silently around the dying embers of their campfire, their faces drawn and weary. Sebastian broke the silence, his voice edged with determination. "We need answers. If we don't figure out what's going on, we won't make it through another night." With cautious resolve, the three men split up, each venturing into the eerie stillness of the abandoned village. Every step felt precarious, their senses sharp as they moved deeper into the unknown. Sebastian entered a large, crumbling hut. The air inside was thick with mildew, and the walls sagged under the weight of time. Dust swirled in the pale shafts of light streaming through cracks in the wooden slats. As he stepped forward, the creak of the floorboards seemed deafening. Near the center of the room, his eyes caught something. A floorboard slightly askew. Kneeling, he worked the tip of his knife into the gap and pried it open. Beneath, he found a leather-bound journal, its cover darkened by the telltale stains of dried blood. His stomach churned as he lifted the journal, its weight feeling oddly significant. The silence in the hut seemed to deepen as he turned it over in his hands. "Guys," he called, his voice echoing faintly in the empty room. "I found something." Cryptic entries. Back at the campfire, the three men huddled close as Sebastian opened the journal. The pages were warped and brittle, the writing jagged and hurried. Dark stains marred the text, smudging the desperate words scrawled across the pages. Sebastian began to read aloud. The villagers performed ritual. They sought protection from the spirits of the jungle. But something went wrong. The soldiers, they became twisted, cursed to wander the jungle, bound to it forever. The further he read, the more frantic the entries became. The curse grows stronger with fear. It thrives on it. We tried to fight them, but they cannot be killed. We are being hunted, doomed. The fire crackled softly as Sebastian's voice trailed off. Mark leaned back, his jaw tight, while Alan stared at the journal as though it might leap from Sebastian's hands. "We need to leave," Alan blurted, his voice shaking. This isn't something we can fight. We have to get out of here." Mark frowned, his expression unreadable. "Running blind will get us killed faster than staying. We need to understand what we're dealing with first." Sebastian closed the journal with a resolute snap, his tone firm. "We'll leave," he said, his gaze steady. "But not yet. We need a plan. Running scared won't save us." Rising tension. The hours dragged on, the daylight offering no respite from the gnawing unease. Mark busied himself with their weapons, his movements deliberate and measured. Alan, on the other hand, grew increasingly restless, pacing and muttering under his breath. His wide eyes darted to every shadow, his knuckles bone-white around his rifle. "We're wasting time!" Alan's voice cracked with frustration. "Sitting here is just waiting to die. We need to move." Mark shot him a glare, his voice clipped. "And rush straight into whatever's out there? Great idea. Enough." Sebastian's voice cut through their argument like a blade. His sharp tone silenced them, though the tension still simmered beneath the surface. "We stick together. If we don't, we're already dead." The weight of his words settled over them, leaving no room for further argument. As dusk crept over the jungle, the village seemed to shrink beneath the oppressive weight of the encroaching night. The fire sputtered and waned, its light barely pushing back the darkness that seemed to press closer with every passing moment. The three men sat in tense silence, their weapons within arm's reach. Every sound, the creak of a tree, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified, each one a potential threat. Then it came, a sound unlike anything they had heard before. It began as a low, guttural growl, swelling into a piercing, inhuman wail that seemed to carry both fury and despair. The chilling noise echoed through the jungle, reverberating in their chests. Alan clutched his rifle tightly, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell was that?" Sebastian's heart thundered as he scanned the darkness, his grip firm on his weapon. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice calm despite the fear gnawing at him. "Eyes on the jungle, don't lose focus." Another howl tore through the air, this one closer. The firelight flickered, casting warped shadows across their faces. The night pressed in around them, heavier than ever. The words from the journal echoed in Sebastian's mind. "It feeds on fear," and fear was all they had left. The first death. Mark's disappearance. The oppressive darkness of the jungle seemed to grow thicker as night fell. The firelight flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and twisted around the camp. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on the group, their nerves frayed and their senses heightened. Mark volunteered for the first patrol, his jaw set with determination. "I'll take the first watch," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We need to stay vigilant." Sebastian nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Be careful. If you see or hear anything, call out immediately." Mark moved away from the camp, his footsteps barely audible on the soft jungle floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant animal cry. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound seemed amplified. He paused, straining his ears. There it was again, a faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing. He turned, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, just the dense foliage and the oppressive silence. "Get a grip, Mark," he muttered to himself, shaking off the unease. But the feeling persisted, a constant prickling at the back of his neck. As the hours dragged on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. He heard faint, indistinct noises, whispers, rustling leaves, the snap of a twig. His heart pounded in his chest, his grip tightening on his rifle. Then, without warning, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Mark spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But before he could react, a shadowy figure lunged at him from the trees. He barely had time to scream before he was dragged into the darkness. His flashlight falling to the ground, its beam flickering and then going out. A grisly discovery. The next morning, the camp was filled with an uneasy silence. Sebastian and Alan had spent the night searching for Mark, but there had been no sign of him. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, they continued their search, their hearts heavy with dread. It was Alan who found him, near the edge of the jungle. He let out a strangled cry, his face going pale as he stumbled back. "Sebastian! Over here!" Sebastian rushed to his side, his stomach churning at the scene before him. Mark's body was sprawled across the ground. His limbs were contorted, twisted at unnatural angles. His flesh was torn and mangled, deep, claw marks raking across his chest and arms. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of sheer terror. The sight was gruesome, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. Flies buzzed around the remains, drawn to the carnage. Sebastian felt bile rise in his throat, but he forced it down, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," Alan said, his voice trembling. "We can't stay. We're next." Conflicting reaction. Sebastian shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "We can't just run. We need to understand what we're dealing with. If we leave now, we'll be running blind." Alan's eyes were wide with fear. "You saw what happened to Mark. We can't fight this. We need to leave, now." Sebastian took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I know it's dangerous, but we need to stay calm. If we panic, we're as good as dead." The tension between them was palpable, the fear and desperation threatening to tear them apart. But Sebastian knew they needed to stay united if they had any hope of surviving. The haunting begins. That night, the camp was shrouded in an oppressive silence. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around them. Sebastian sat by the fire, his eyes scanning the darkness, every muscle tense. As the hours dragged on, he heard it, a faint voice calling out from the jungle. It was Mark's voice, filled with pain and desperation. "Help me, please!" Sebastian's heart pounded in his chest. He knew it couldn't be real, but the sound was so clear, so haunting. He stood, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he moved toward the sound. "Mark?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Is that you?" The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me!" Sebastian moved deeper into the jungle, his flashlight beam flickering. He saw a shadowy figure darting between the trees, just at the edge of his vision. He followed, his heart racing, but the figure always stayed just out of reach. Finally, he stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice had fallen silent, the jungle once again shrouded in an oppressive silence. He turned back toward the camp, his mind racing with fear and confusion. As he returned to the fire, he knew one thing for certain. The nightmare was far from over, and the true horror was only just beginning. The chase under siege. The oppressive atmosphere of the jungle grew more menacing with each passing hour. The spirits, once elusive and hidden, began to stalk the group openly. Claw marks appeared on the trees surrounding their camp, deep and jagged, a chilling reminder of the danger they faced. Eerie totems, made from twisted branches and bones, were left in their path, each one more grotesque than the last. Sebastian and Alan huddled close to the fire, their eyes wide with fear. The spirits' attacks grew more frequent and intense, their guttural howls echoing through the jungle, sending shivers down their spines. "We can't stay here," Alan said, his voice trembling. "They're toying with us. We need to move." Sebastian nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Pack up, we leave now." A desperate escape. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the spirits seemed to anticipate their every move. The group was herded like prey, the spirits' presence felt at every turn. The jungle itself seemed to conspire against them, the dense foliage and twisted roots making their progress slow and treacherous. Alan's panic grew with each step, his breathing ragged and his eyes wild. "They're everywhere," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We can't escape them." Sebastian tried to keep the group focused, but the sense of urgency was palpable. They narrowly escaped several close encounters, the spirits' claws swiping at them from the shadows, their eerie whispers filling the air. "We need to find shelter," Sebastian said, his voice strained. "Somewhere we can regroup and figure out our next move." The cave. Just as hope seemed lost, they stumbled upon a hidden cave, its entrance marked with strange symbols carved into the rock. The symbols were ancient and unsettling, their meaning lost to time. But the cave offered a temporary refuge from the relentless pursuit of the spirits. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls lined with ritualistic drawings and bones. The drawings depicted scenes of the village's dark past, rituals gone wrong, spirits unleashed, and the villagers' desperate attempts to contain the curse. Sebastian's flashlight beam flickered over a small alcove, revealing more journal entries hidden among the bones. He carefully retrieved them, his hands shaking with anticipation. A ray of hope. As they huddled in the cave, Sebastian read the new entries aloud. The journal described a ritual that might end the curse, a glimmer of hope in their darkest hour. The ritual required specific materials and precise steps, each one more dangerous than the last. "The ritual can weaken the spirits," Sebastian said, his voice filled with determination. "But it won't be easy. We need to gather the materials and perform it exactly as described." Alan's face was pale, his eyes filled with fear. "What if it doesn't work? What if we make things worse?" Sebastian met his gaze, his expression resolute. "We don't have a choice. It's our only chance." The group nodded in agreement, their fear tempered by a newfound sense of purpose. They knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but the possibility of ending the curse gave them the strength to continue. As they prepared to leave the cave, the jungle outside seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive silence a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured. The spirits were still out there, waiting, but now the group had a plan, a fragile hope that might just see them through the nightmare. The second death. The relentless pursuit by the spirits took its toll on Alan. His descent into madness was marked by small, unsettling behaviors that escalated over time. He muttered to himself constantly, his eyes darting to every shadow, every rustle of leaves. His hands trembled, and he clutched his rifle as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Sebastian watched with growing concern as Alan's paranoia deepened. Alan began to see threats where there were none, lashing out at imagined enemies. He refused to sleep, convinced that the spirits would attack the moment he closed his eyes. "We're all doomed," Alan whispered one night, his voice trembling. "They're going to get us!" just like they got Mark. Sebastian tried to reassure him, but the fear in Alan's eyes was unshakable. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the oppressive silence amplifying every creak and whisper. A grim fate. One night, as they huddled around a small fire in the cave, the spirits launched a sudden, ferocious attack. The air was filled with guttural howls and the sound of claws scraping against stone. Alan's eyes widened in terror, and he scrambled to his feet, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. "They're here!" he screamed, his voice filled with panic. "They're coming for us." Before Sebastian could react, the spirits descended upon them. Shadowy figures lunged from the darkness, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Alan fired wildly, his shots echoing through the cave, but it was no use. The spirits were relentless. In a blur of motion, the spirits grabbed Alan, dragging him toward the jungle. He screamed, his voice filled with desperation and fear. "Help me! Sebastian, help me!" Sebastian stood frozen, paralyzed by fear and guilt. He watched helplessly as Alan was pulled into the darkness, his screams fading into the night. The spirit's howls echoed in Sebastian's ears, a haunting reminder of his failure. Isolation and guilt. Alone and traumatized, Sebastian retreated deeper into the cave. The journal's words haunted him, their dire warnings echoing in his mind. He could hear Mark and Alan's voices accusing him of failure, their words filled with pain and betrayal. "You let us die," Mark's voice whispered, a ghostly echo in the darkness. "You should have saved me," Alan's voice added, filled with despair. Sebastian's guilt weighed heavily on him, the burden almost too much to bear. He felt the walls of the cave closing in, the darkness pressing down on him. But he knew he couldn't give up. He had to find a way to end the nightmare. Determined to end the curse, Sebastian decided to perform the ritual described in the journal. The instructions were vague and ominous, but it was their only hope. He gathered the materials mentioned in the journal, symbols, blood and fire, each step more dangerous than the last. As he prepared for the ritual, the jungle outside seemed to hold its breath. The oppressive silence, a stark contrast to the chaos he had endured. The spirits were still out there, waiting, but Sebastian was ready to face them. With a deep breath, he began the ritual, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. The air grew thick with tension, the shadows deepening around him. He could feel the spirits' presence, their eyes watching him from the darkness. As the ritual progressed, the spirits grew more agitated, their howls filling the air. But Sebastian pressed on, determined to see it through. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but the possibility of ending the curse gave him the strength to continue. The night was far from over, and the true horror was only just beginning. The ritual preparation. Sebastian knew that performing the ritual would be their only chance to end the curse. The journal's instructions were vague and ominous, but he had no choice. He began gathering the materials mentioned in the journal, symbols, blood, and fire. The first challenge was finding the symbols. The journal described them as ancient runes, carved into stone scattered throughout. The jungle seemed to conspire against him, the dense foliage and twisted roots making his progress slow and treacherous. Finally, he found the first stone, its surface etched with strange, intricate symbols. He carefully copied the runes onto a piece of cloth, his hands shaking with anticipation. The next stone was even harder to find. hidden beneath a tangle of roots. Each discovery brought a mix of relief and dread, the weight of the task pressing down on him. The next step was the blood. The journal was clear. It had to be his own. With a deep breath, Sebastian made a small cut on his palm, letting the blood drip onto the cloth with the symbols. The pain was sharp, but he pushed through it, knowing it was necessary. Finally, he needed fire. The jungle was damp, the wood wet and difficult to ignite. He struggled to get a flame going, his frustration mounting, but eventually the fire caught, its flickering light casting eerie shadows on the cave walls. The spirit's arrival. As Sebastian began the ritual, the air grew thick with tension. The shadows seemed to deepen, the oppressive silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. He chanted the words from the journal, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. The spirits materialized, their forms shifting between human and beast. Their eyes glowed with malevolent intent, their guttural sounds filling the air. They circled him, their movements fluid and predatory. Their bodies were twisted and grotesque, a horrifying blend of man and animal. Sebastian's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to continue. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, their power palpable. He could feel their anger, their desperation to break free from the curse. Flashbacks! As the ritual progressed, memories from Sebastian's past began to surface. He saw himself as a young soldier, fresh out of training, eager to prove himself. The flashbacks were vivid and painful, each one a reminder of his guilt and regret. In one memory, he was leading a mission in a war-torn village. The orders were clear: secure the area and eliminate any threats. But things went horribly wrong. A miscommunication led to a tragic mistake. Innocent villagers were caught in the crossfire. The faces of the victims, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, haunted him. He could still hear their screams, the chaos and bloodshed seared into his mind. Another memory surfaced, this one of a fellow soldier, a close friend who had trusted Sebastian with his life. During a fierce battle, Sebastian made a second decision that he thought would save them both. But it backfired, and his friend was killed. The guilt of that moment, the weight of his friend's death, had never left him. The flashbacks paralleled the curse's themes of survival and morality. The spirits seemed to sense his inner turmoil, their attacks growing more ferocious. They exploited his fears, their whispers echoing in his mind. "You failed them," they hissed. "You will fail again." A fragile balance. Despite the onslaught, Sebastian pressed on. The ritual began to weaken the spirits, their forms flickering and fading, but they fought back, their rage and despair fueling their attacks. The balance was fragile, the outcome uncertain. Sebastian's resolve was tested to its limits. The pain from his wounds, the weight of his guilt, and the relentless assault of the spirits threatened to break him. But he knew he couldn't give up. The lives of his friends, the fate of the village, depended on him. With a final, desperate effort, he completed the ritual. The spirits let out a collective howl, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting. Sebastian collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. He didn't know if the ritual had truly ended the curse, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. The night was far from over, but the worst seemed to be behind him. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. The nightmare was not yet over, but he had taken the first step toward ending it. Confrontation. The heart of the curse. As Sebastian completed the ritual, the jungle dissolved into a surreal, nightmarish realm. The ground twisted into jagged rocks, and the sky churned with dark clouds. In the center stood the spirit's leader, a towering figure embodying rage and despair, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. A test of will. The battle was both psychological and physical. The spirit's leader exploited Sebastian's deepest fears and regrets, bombarding him with visions of his past failures, innocent villagers caught in the crossfire, the death of his close friend. The ground shifted beneath him, threatening to swallow him whole. "You failed them," the spirit's leader hissed. "You will fail again." Sebastian fought back, his resolve tested to its limits. The spirit's attacks were relentless, but he pushed through the pain and guilt, determined to end the curse. The sacrifice. To weaken the spirits, Sebastian made a deeply personal sacrifice, a cherished memory of his family, a moment of happiness and peace. The pain of letting go was excruciating, but it was necessary. The spirit's leader howled in rage, its form flickering and weakening. A faint victory. The spirits dissolved into the shadows, the nightmarish realm fading back into the jungle. Sebastian collapsed, unsure if he had succeeded. The jungle was eerily quiet, the oppressive presence of the spirits gone. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope, but the true horror might still be lurking in the shadows. Rescue. The first light of dawn filtered through the jungle canopy, casting a soft glow over the clearing. Sebastian lay on the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. He was barely conscious when the rescue team found him, their voices distant and muffled. "Over here! We've got a survivor!" Strong hands lifted him, and he was carried through the jungle, the oppressive weight of the curse lifting with each step. The rescue team's presence was a stark contrast to the horrors he had faced, their voices a lifeline pulling him back to reality. Back home, Sebastian was hailed as a survivor, but the experience had left deep scars. The jungle's horrors haunted him, the memories of Mark and Alan's deaths, a constant reminder of the nightmare he had endured. Subtle signs of the curse lingered, whispers in the night, flickers of shadows at the edge of his vision, a constant chill that never seemed to leave him. He tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, but the weight of his experiences was always there, a shadow over his every moment. The faces of those he had failed haunted his dreams, their voices a constant reminder of his guilt and regret. One evening, as Sebastian sat alone in his apartment, he heard a faint whisper. It was a voice he recognized, filled with pain and desperation. "Sebastian, help me!" He turned, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the shadows deep and oppressive. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." Sebastian knew the curse might not be entirely gone. The jungle's horrors had left their mark, a lingering presence that refused to be forgotten. He stood, his resolve firm. He had faced the nightmare once, and he would face it again if he had to. The story ends with a subtle but chilling hint that the curse might not be entirely gone, leaving readers with an eerie sense of uncertainty. The jungle's shadows still lingered, and the true horror might still be lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike.